Here is a letter written to a newspaper, the Nyasaland Times. It was written by John Chilembwe, an African from what is now Malawi. Now, Malawi is just above Zimbabwe, it's below Rwanda, a small country in the center of Africa. John Chilembwe had been educated at the Church of Scotland Mission Station, and he studied further at the Virginia Theological College in the United States. And he returned to Nyasaland in 1902 as an ordained Baptist minister, where he founded his Providence Industrial Mission. He established several schools, and he built a large brick church. The letter he wrote to the Nyasaland Times was written at the outbreak of the First World War. He entitled it "The Voice of the African Natives in the Present War." We understand that we have been invited to shed our blood in the world's war, which is now in progress throughout the wide world. On the commencement of the war, we understood that it was said indirectly that Africa had nothing to do with the civilized war. But now we find that the poor African has already been plunged into the Great War. We ask the honorable government of our country, which is known as Nyasaland, will there be any prospects for the natives at the end of the war? Shall we be recognized as anyone in the best interests of civilization and Christianity after the great struggle is ended? Because we are more imposed upon than any other nationality under the sun. Any true gentleman who will read this without the eye of prejudice will agree and recognize the fact that the natives have been loyal since the commencement of this government, and that in all parts of Nyasaland their welfare has been incomplete without us. For our part, we have never allowed the Nyasaland flag to touch the ground, while honor and credit have gone to others. We have unreservedly stepped into the firing line of every conflict and played a patriot's part with a spirit of true gallantry. But in time of peace, the government failed to help the underdog. In time of peace, everything for Europeans only, and instead of honor, we suffer humiliation with names contemptible. But in time of war, it has been found that we are needed to share the hardships and to shed our blood in equality. If this were a war for honor, government gain of riches, and so on, we would have been boldly told, let the rich man, the bankers, titlemen, shopkeepers, farmers and landlords go to war and get shot. Instead, the poor Africans who have nothing to own in this world, who in death leave only a long line of widows and orphans, and utter want and dire distress, are invited to die for a cause which is not theirs. We leave all for the consideration of the government. We hope in the mercy of Almighty God that someday things will turn out well, and the government will recognize our indispensability, and that justice will prevail. Signed, John Chilembwe, in behalf of his countrymen. The newspaper chose not to publish the letter. So Chilembwe led a revolt, and the revolt was crushed. And Chilembwe was shot, and his followers were hanged or imprisoned. His Baptist church on the top of Chiradzulu Hill was dynamited. Photographs of the destroyed church were printed as postcards and sent around the British colonies. Now, I wrote a feature film script based on the story, which was never made, and quite correctly. I had no sense at all of what one person in the film could say to anyone else in the film. But I think I was impelled to write the script by the image of the two postcards, of the church intact and the church in ruins, and by the broad logic of colonialism providing its own critique, the language of the Enlightenment used to criticize its own institutions, the colonial project failing its own, in Rawlsian's term, test of justice as fairness, and Chilembwe and others' calls for recognition, for equality, even if only of shed blood, and for justice fell on deaf ears. The logic of a century of anti-colonialism was compressed into 3 weeks of the revolt. The film script included a copy of the letter which I've just read for you, and for 20 years this letter has sat in a drawer in my studio. only to be taken out and unfolded for this lecture. In 1904, that's 11 years earlier, another revolt was launched against the colonists in what was then German Southwest Africa. It was a new colony. German missionaries had come to spread the word of a Lutheran God in the 1890s. Cattle traders had followed. After a drought and cattle disease in the late 1890s, local inhabitants, the Hereros, sold off vast tracts of land for a pittance, a familiar story in colonial matters. When the drought ended and the herds started to revive, the sale of land was regretted and attempts were made to recapture some of the land. The initial revolt was successful. Some farmers were killed. The garrison of the local town was repulsed when they intervened. And this was a calamity. An initial success in colonial revolts is always a calamity. The metropolitan center, in this case Germany, was mortified and made sure not to underreact. An expeditionary force was sent out under General von Trotter, and he made a proclamation of annihilation, a Vernichtungsbefehl. Over the next 3 years, starting with the Battle of Waterberg, over 80% of the Herero population was killed. They went from 110,000 down to between 15 and 18,000 people. They were either killed in battle or driven into the desert to die of hunger and thirst. Now, this was the first German genocide of the last century, which was afterwards overlooked in the light of larger projects. But the skulls of many of those Hereros who were killed were boiled, skinned, and thus sanitized, were sent back to Berlin to the Institute for Physical Anatomy. There they were measured, analyzed, catalogued, which was part of a rational scientific project to make a taxonomy of human heads. The Aryan head, the criminal head, the Negro head, the Jewish head, a new great chain of being. Now, this may seem a long way off, beginning of the last century, but it is still extremely current. In September of last year, 2011, only then were the skulls taken in 1904, repatriated from the basement of the museum in Berlin, where they had survived the bombardment of the Second World War, and returned to the representatives of their descendants in Windhoek. And compensations against the German government go through the law courts as we speak. But the ironies continue to reverberate. In Windhoek, the capital of what is now Namibia, the main monument to the genocide is an equestrian statue of a German soldier. At the Waterberg, the site of the first battle, which I mentioned, there is a well-tended cemetery of German soldiers who died in that battle, and I think there were 17 soldiers who died, and not a word regarding the thousands of Hereros who died in the battle, nor the tens of thousands who died afterwards. And this is not an old history. This is where we are still embedded in questions that surround questions of the drone attacks in Afghanistan, or the remarkable work that Médecins Sans Frontières is doing in Somalia. The Herero genocide is part of a continuing series of questions and actions, questions of seeing, understanding, and the use of violence that stretch back from Plato's cave, we were talking about last week, to where we are now. And for them, the studio becomes an emblematic place for addressing some of these questions. To see where we are. Last week we started in Plato's cave, looking at the philosopher who had the moral right and obligation to return to the cave and take people from darkness and light. So we started a question surrounding lightness and dark as metaphors for ignorance and understanding, and the possibility or necessary of violence that accompanies that. In this lecture, we will continue this examination of the metaphor of light and darkness, of lightness dissipating illusion and ignorance, and we will look at a later version of Plato's metaphor, at the 18th century of Enlightenment, and at the 19th and 20th manifestations of the Enlightenment in colonization, specifically in Africa. I will start with broader observations, but as with last week, everything will be brought back to the studio. When I started these lectures, I had anticipated and tried very hard to say we would only get to the studio in lecture 4. But I find that in each lecture, sooner or later, we need to come back to the studio. So I will begin, as we did last week, with something that has its origins in the studio, an ur-text against which the thrust of the lecture must be understood. 8 years ago, I directed a production of Mozart's Magic Flute, and followed this with a series of projects that explored the questions and images that the work on the opera itself had revealed. We will start with some preparatory work that I did, which were images made for the overture of the opera, which I did to try to find the language, the vocabulary, the visual vocabulary for working on the whole production. The overture, which we will watch, is approximately 7 minutes long. Now, Mozart wrote the Magic Flute in 1791, the last year of his life. And of course, he cannot be held responsible for everything that has been done to the opera in the 2 centuries since he wrote it. But neither can we attend a performance of the opera without being aware of all that sits inside us as we watch it. Our sense of our present time, of other times, of the histories which fill the gap between Mozart's writing of the opera and our watching of the opera. To refresh our minds about the opera itself. There is Tamino, a young prince, and he is sent by a queen to rescue the queen's daughter, Pamina, from the clutches of Zarastro, a powerful wizard, who has abducted her. The prince rescues the princess, and after a series of trials, they are united. Love triumphs, end of story. To flesh it out one step further, though, there is Tamino, the young prince. He's sent by the queen to rescue her daughter, Pamina, from Zarastro, who has abducted her. Tamino is given a flute with magical powers to help in the trials of freeing Pamina. There's a complication. Zarastro is not a wizard. In fact, he is a wise man who has rescued Pamina from the clutches of her mother, the queen, who in fact is a psychopath. And Zarastro is keeping her in protective custody, waiting for Tamino to arrive and claim her. After proving his worth by undergoing various tests, Tamino and Pamina are united. Love and music in the service of love triumph. The end of the story. But to go again one step further, Tamino, a young prince, is sent by the Queen of the Night to rescue her daughter Pamina, who has been abducted by Zarastro, who is the high priest of the Temple of the Sun. Using the magic flute, he tames all the dangers that beset him: beasts, sexual temptation, fire, flood, even death. Zarastro is the high priest of light, of the Temple of the Sun, and the queen is the queen of the night, of darkness. He has rescued Pamina from the clutches of her psychopathic mother and darkness, and is keeping her in protective custody, waiting for Tamino, who is Zarastro's choice of mate for Pamina, to arrive and claim her. Both Tamina and Pamina have to undergo a series of tests to see if they are worthy of making the journey from darkness into the light of wisdom. They make their way through the darkness of an underground cave, through an underground world, and emerge from their cave. The Queen of the Night and her allies are killed. Tamino and Pamina are united. Love and enlightenment win. The final stage direction even says, the stage becomes the sun. We are at the end of Plato's myth. End of story. Now, there are many sets of associations and questions that emerge from the opera. It's an Orpheus and Eurydice story, but this time with the difference that in fact it is Pamina, Eurydice, that leads Tamino, Orpheus, out of the underworld. It's an opera, about the power of music, in this case music in the service of love. And of course it brings us back to Plato's cave, with Zarastro, Plato's philosopher king, combining a monopoly of wisdom with a monopoly of power and violence. Part of the preparation for doing the production of the opera was listening to many different recordings of it. And one of the recordings that stood out was a recording of the production conducted by Sir Thomas Beecham, made in Berlin in 1938. It is, of course, an old-style recording of the music, for Beecham is looking backwards from Brahms, backwards towards Mozart. It has a huge orchestra. It has a majestic, slow pace, which is very different from most contemporary interpretations of the opera, which often come from behind Mozart, from the Baroque, and look at Mozart from the Baroque forward, with small orchestras, quicker tempi, older styles of instruments, catgut rather than steel strings, horns without valves, forte pianos, and so on. Now, ostensibly, this is done in the name of finding an original sound, being closer to Mozart, as if our ears could somehow be cleansed of all sounds they have heard since 1791, the roar of steam engines, of jets, the rhythm of dot matrix printers, of all the music written and performed since then, to take us back to a pre-industrial innocence. But there is more to this modern reading of Mozart than this, I think. There cannot but be an anxiety over what that generous, slow, full orchestral sound brings with it, and the deep armchair comfort that Beecham pushes us into. The music critic George Bernard Shaw famously said that if God had had a voice, it would have been the voice of Sarastro. Now here are two recordings of Sarastro's second aria. The first recording was made within the last 2 years, and the second recording comes from about 70 years earlier. Now, this astonishing recording was made by Wilhelm Streins in the Thomas Beecham recording, made at the Staatsoper in Berlin in 1938. Now, here we hit a wall which we have to face. The inescapable contradiction between Mozart's world of the spirit and the brute reality of a performance of that opera in that city at that time. Sarastro's second aria that we were listening to in Dieser Heilige Halle is a hymn to the generosity and benevolence of the world. Within these holy bounds, revenge is unknown, and if a man fails, love will lead him back to duty. Within these holy walls where brotherly love abides, enemies are forgiven, and so on. Now there is a question, of course, whether we should pay any attention to the libretto of Schikaneder, who is the actor impresario who persuaded Mozart to write the opera for him, to help him out of financial straits that he was in. Or whether we should dismiss the libretto as being without substance, as many critics have. I mean, there are contradictions within the libretto. The Queen of the Night in Act 1 seems very good, and Sarastro bad. It changes in the second act. Some people see these contradictions as undermining the opera. I would suggest that, in fact, it is these very contradictions that often make the interest which makes us keep coming back and back to elements of the story. Now, these contradictions may have been the result of unskill on the part of Schikaneder's part as a dramaturg, or a lack of caring. I mean, Sarastro makes his first entry onto the stage in what the stage directions call for a chariot drawn by 6 lions. Now, it's not because the 6 lions are needed by the character or the story, but because Schikaneder had 6 wonderful cardboard lions in his prop store, which had not had a good outing. The authenticity of the origins of an image are not in question here. I mean, the particular high notes that Mozart gives the Queen of the Night to sing were written because Mozart's sister-in-law was able to reach those notes. But having said that, what do they bring with them? The low, sonorous reassurance, the fatherly tone of Sarastro, against the high-pitched notes of the Queen of the Night. A high pitch associated with hysteria and abandonment of reason, a temper tantrum against the low, reassuring volume of Sarastro. I mean, as the notes get lower and lower into the lowest register of a bass singer, the volume gets lower and lower. And as the notes get higher and higher, it becomes more and more difficult to control the volume with which the notes get sung. I mean, Margaret Thatcher understood this extremely well when she went to have the tone of her voice lowered. And it's a question whether, in fact, any natural soprano has yet become the president or prime minister of any country. Mozart himself had great belief in the libretto. It was more than a fairy tale, though it was a fairy tale as well. It was Mozart's Masonic opera, a statement of belief about the world, a world of possible benevolence, wisdom, freedom from superstition, even, of course, as it invoked the supernatural for the story to progress. A belief in knowledge that was derived neither from kingly birth, nor from God, nor from the church. In the same era, you will remember that Washington and Jefferson were also Freemasons and held to precepts embodying what we now take for granted as the basis of liberal principles of rational thinking and democratic government. And then, of course, the central metaphor of the opera of darkness and light, the Queen of the Night and Zarastro, also characterized in the stage directions of dark caverns giving way to the temple of the sun, illusion giving way to knowledge. The photographic and the projection of the photographic became for me the terrain for exploring the argument. In the studio and on stage, this meant setting the opera in the 19th century and using the associations of photography to shift between darkness and light. Perhaps we talk a little bit about time in opera. It seems there are always at least 7 different times that operate as we watch an opera. The first is obviously the era in which it is written, 1791 when Mozart writes the opera. Then the 21st century in which we are aware of ourselves now watching the opera. A third time is the supposed time in which the opera is set in its libretto, which is some imagined Egypt of the indeterminate past. A fourth, in my case the 19th century, is where the particular production is placed, where you see the sets and the costumes. And then there are 3 other ways of thinking about time in the production. The first is, of course, the 3 hours that the opera takes to go from the start curtain to the end of the performance, which is a conflation of the whole day in which the opera is supposed to happen for the composer. And then finally, of course, the expansion of a single moment of time, a moment of thought, into the 6 or 7 minutes of the singing of an aria. So there are many different ways when we're watching an opera that there is this kind of temporal gymnastics which happens in all of us, whether we like it or not, of shifting time scales and expectations. And I said with this production, it was set in the 19th century. At base, I was trying to show the need for darkness, for shadow to be present, for anything to be visible. To think of the Queen of the Night as a photographic negative to the photographic positive or photograph of the imprint of Zarastro. I mean, the Temple of the Sun, called for by Plato and by the end of the opera, is a happy ending, but it is also the completely overexposed film. It is the light at the projector when the film has finished running through it, and the reel of film runs out, and there's nothing more to see or to say. For me, the clear light of the sun had been thrown into question both by the shock of imagining Zarastro's aria in the swastika-bedecked Staatsoper of 1938, and also, of course, by so much of the post-history of Mozart's opera. But let's go back one stage further. The photographic metaphor of the Queen of the Night and Zarastro and the stage as a chambre noire of an old box bellows camera. The camera and the old black box at its center is a venue for the inversion of an image, a necessary darkness to capture light, a meaning made in the space between the iris of the lens and the photographic plate. The eye is the monocular Masonic eye, but it is also the prince's eye of Baroque theater design. And of course, it is also the eye in the viewfinder of the camera. The idea of the stage as camera came not from an analysis of the text or the music, but from the provocations of the medium and the pressures of the studio. In preparation for the opera, I had worked on the overture, which we looked at the beginning of the lecture. I had been invited to exhibit in a 14th century German hall, which was wood-paneled, and there were very strict instructions that nothing could touch the wooden paneling. So I decided to do a projection on a screen on a tripod in front of this beautiful paneling. And in fact, I made the screen on the projection on a blackboard. I'm sure thinking of Joseph Beuys in the context of an exhibition in Germany. Now, to do a projection on a blackboard, you need white lines, and there are two ways of making these white lines on a black background. You can draw with white chalk or white pastel on black paper, but here one comes up against the crudeness of the actual line, the softness of the pastel, and that no line can be thinner than a finger. The alternative to have more flexibility is to draw with black lines on white paper, where you can use charcoal of varying thicknesses, from crude marks to very fine lines, a sharpened pencil. You can use the ink in a fountain pen. The range of possible marks is varied. And then one can invert the image, to use the photographic negative of the image, turning the black lines white and the white paper black. Now it was in this moment of inversion, which was a moment of inversion provoked by having to make the projection, by the needs of the material, the needs of the studio, that the image of the production was born, of the metaphor of the photographic, of the possibility of the stage as the chambre noire, a coming together of studio procedures and possibilities, and the overdetermined history, text, and context of the opera arriving from outside. Now, it is unfair, of course, to make Sarastro a prior incarnation of von Trotter, General von Trotter from the Vernichtungsbefehl, a man with a monopoly of violence, there to take those outside the light, by whatever means necessary, into the world of European civilization. Von Trotter would not have invoked the defense of reason as his motive, but he would have seen himself as embodying the civilized needs of Europe, of employing a necessary terror to have the job done. He may well have seen himself as a Sarastro figure. I mean, Mozart wrote the Magic Flute in 1791, when an optimism and a clear belief in the Enlightenment and its project was possible. And such an optimism is no longer available. Not just the individual monsters of history, but the calamitous history of colonialism, the primary political manifestation of the Enlightenment, are object lessons we cannot ignore. Robespierre, himself a Mason, was a contemporary of Mozart and the opera. The Great Terror was Platonism in action. His philosophy of rationality of the decimal system, the decimalization of time, the kilogram, the kilometer, could have been invented by Sarastro. And it's remarkable how many of these French revolutionary perspectives on the world are instituted now and naturalized as if this is the only way in which we could imagine the world. Robespierre, with his combination of the assumption of wisdom in the name of rationality and of violence and terror, sets the stage. And every tyrant since then would have described himself as a Sarastro, and by extension the philosopher king from Plato's cave, using whatever means necessary to drag, to pull the unenlightened into the sunlight to join the electrification of the Soviet Union, to reach the clear fields of peasant life in Pol Pot's Cambodia, to insist on the American way of life in Vietnam. It is not that every act of violence necessarily has its brochures, its public relations, its justifications, but more difficult than that is that every act of enlightenment, all the missions to save souls, all the best impulses are so dogged by the weight of what follows them, their shadow, the violence that has accompanied the Enlightenment. The Colonial project, in its own description of bringing light to darkness, is a gruesome working out of Plato's cave. And we're here at what I suspect is the most painful part of these lectures. which is the understanding of a deep commitment to the Enlightenment project, to its promises of emancipation, of ending worlds of superstition, of received religion, but so aware of what follows behind it. And finally, in my own case, I suppose, a lack of confidence in action in the world and a retreat into the studio, in the belief that in the recondite and unclear and ambiguous way, the work in the studio is still connected to these larger questions from outside of it, which I could not solve. Rather caught up with the question of what place elements of the spirit of the mind of ideals have today, or whether, and this does seem impossible to accept, that every impulse for good, for generosity, for emancipation is flawed and is an impotent structure floating above the world of realpolitik, of violence, of takeovers and mergers. But these are not questions that pose themselves like this in the studio. They hover in the background. They enter into the studio in material form. To bring it back to the studio, I mean, what is pinned up on the walls of the studio? The libretto of the opera, the music of Zarastro, the typewritten Vernichtungsbefehl, the foot lashing of Monostatos, the whipping of laborers in German Southwest Africa turned into postcards for Christmas greetings, an archive of colonial images, which is a constructed overdetermination, an excess of material gathered to heat the image up, to provoke the making, to let making jump ahead of thinking. To prepare for the making of the opera of the Magic Flute, I made 2 miniature theaters. Now, the first was simply a maquette of the set for the production of the Magic Theatre, of the Magic Flute, made to test the projections, looking at a Baroque set as a possible projection screen. Could one project an image onto a painted backdrop and still have the image clearly visible? And the second miniature theatre was a theatre of automatons made to look at the political underbelly of the Magic Flute, to tell the story of the Herero genocide, and to see what the music of Sarastro became, transformed in various different ways. The studio and the miniature theatre become a compression chamber for images, for ideas, for historical links. The miniature theatre, a studio reduced even further, a space for the elements to bounce off each other. The measuring of skulls, a pair of dividers, the 19th century French egg whisk. The miniature theatre and the studio both become equivalents for the ideas themselves and from what happens inside the walls of our skulls. The head as a cloud chamber. Now, this is where clarity starts to break down. The linearity of language, of one sentence and one thought having to follow another, becomes inadequate to describe the process. And a stream of consciousness is also not an adequate formulation. It implies the flow of one thought into another. It's rather that one needs a highway of consciousness. There should be a way of registering all the different thoughts running parallel to each other, one pausing, one stuck at a roadblock, one taking an off-ramp and arriving on the page, until one thought emerges ahead of the others and emerges on the page. This problem of putting elements of the lecture into a linear progression, a lateral procession, when what you really need is a full frontal assault of all the different ideas being able to arrive at the same time. In the studio, this is much easier. There are different fragments, there are pieces of paper all around the walls of the studio. You can see them together in a glance, you can tear them, juxtapose them in different ways. Even in a single drawing, you can pick up the whole drawing in a glance and then interrogate different sections in a not necessarily linear way. The circling of the studio, going round these images which are up on the walls of the studio, is both a conjuring or an invocation of these images, but also the way of arriving at an adjudication of which one to begin with. The task here is to try to show how through this cacophony of excess, we can pull a meaning out. How through a cacophony of excess and uncertainty, we can arrive at a set of different meanings. How through this cacophony of excess and uncertainty and indecision, we can invite a viewer to make a possible sense. How through a cacophony of excess and uncertainty and indecision, we invite the viewer to sit with us and contemplate the impossibility of making sense. We need to put together Vienna in 1791, Nyasaland in 1915, Berlin in 1884, Johannesburg in 2011, Cambridge here, 2012, the Congo in 1936, Paris in 1904. The invention of Africa, Berlin, 1938, Nyasaland, 1915. Picasso on safari, Paris. Africa has been invented 6 times. The seventh invention in the 1980s and 90s is still in dispute because its historians are led against the newspapers, the Nyasaland Times. Keeping on your feet, to accept these images, first invented in the 726 panoply of laws and words made by the government with his map of the ethical demand of the face of flies in the face of what it would be positing an everyone to be equal number 15 to the south, Sarastro. Within the second invention of the idea of Africa came from the spread of Islam. We understand that we have been invited to shed our blood in this world's war to duty, which is not to be second-class citizens, not to bring ships by their blankets, their pipes, happy, the straw huts into a better land. In time of peace, Africa the government invented for the third time in the early stages of the modern era. Everything the first explorers circumnavigated where men loved their subscribing shoreline, no traitor and contemptible. The continent, because enemies are forgiven. Because identity politics is in the time of war, it has been found that the universal teaching does not please, shed our blood does not deserve to be a man. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 and 10. To flesh it out last time for the government, even at that Africa was invented by the rich hats on the streets of the city, reading newspapers, and shops living in small groups, and landlords gifts that never get money in the 1920s, from the never gave people from outside to own diaspora, who said from Africa, waiting for widow to pass African want, and this construct of existentialist Tamino, which is similar across huge geographical spans, cultural language, religious difference, sentiments and political movements in behalf of his country. What makes the continent? Genetics, history, and tradition.
End of story.
End of story.
End of story. End of story.
Africa has been invented 6 times. The 7th invention in the 1980s and 90s is still disputed by various historians and theorists of development. But Africa was first invented in 137 AD by Ptolemy with his map of the world, which showed Egypt and other parts of North Africa, while positing an unknown and unknowable land to the south. This unknown other land was Africa for centuries, the Africa for Hegel, who even in 1808 could write that after the pyramids, world spirit leaves Africa, never to return. There are further elaborations of Ptolemy's invention. The Phoenicians and the Hebrews in the Horn of Africa were added to those on the Mediterranean coast. The second invention of Africa came from the spread of Islam from the Arab Peninsula into the north of the continent. Africa was invented for a third time in the early stages of the modern era, with the first explorers circumnavigating it, describing a shoreline, an outline, the continent as a line. This was the continentalization of Africa. The fourth time the continent was invented was in the 19th century, when with a rush Europe came from the shoreline into the center, dividing the continent amongst themselves, staking claims to land, inhabitants, new materials. The fifth invention of Africa came in the 1920s, when again people from outside of Africa, a diaspora of descendants of slaves taken from Africa, proclaimed a Pan-Africanism. This construct of existential similarity across huge geographical areas, ignoring cultural, language, and religious differences in the name of an essentialism, struck a chord with much of the anti-colonial sentiment and political movements inside Africa. It came from outside of Africa, but spoke on Africa's behalf. This contradiction continues of a continent being assessed from outside itself for what it is, as if the long view, the view in which a continent can fit onto a single page of a map, in which all its differences can be obliterated into a single thought, continues today. It's unclear what makes the continent: history, tradition, and whether talking of it as a continent makes any sense except as the locus, as a provocation for the discussion of Africanness itself. Another thought of geography. During the apartheid years of my childhood and early adulthood, the world changed shape. As more and more countries distanced themselves from the nationalist government in South Africa and its library of exclusionist legislation and its brutal enforcement of its laws, huge land masses started disappearing. The list of countries one could visit on a South African passport shrank. South America disappeared under the waves. Not just Cuba, but Mexico, Brazil, Colombia. Only the islands of Uruguay and Paraguay, with their dictatorships friendly to South Africa, remained, and Chile under General Pinochet. Australia and New Zealand remained, and other colonies held firm. But most of Africa, most of Asia receded. India, only a rumor of it. China gone, Indonesia gone. The Soviet Union and all of Eastern Europe became invisible. Japan remained. In the Byzantine South African race classifications, Japanese people were classified as honorary white, and so Japan remained. All of Africa disappeared. Sudan, Nigeria, Egypt, Ghana, as countries got their independence from colonial powers, they would distance themselves from South Africa. South African planes denied overfly rights and routes, followed a 16th century route to Europe around the coast. And we had to take the existence of the world on trust. In primary school, another example of Africa from Johannesburg, in a subject called social studies, we would see films made by the Department of Education, films of rural African life, of an essential Africa with local variants. A child herding cows, Zulu boys stick fighting, always with a benevolent, godlike commentary. In my memory, it was always a high camera angle, looking down on the objects of the film, with commentaries like, "See the Swazi maiden collecting water at the stream. Careful, do not let it spill. Mother will be angry." There was sunset over straw huts and reeds, the stamping of maize with mortars and pestles, a matriarch smoking her pipe at a hut's entrance. Now, it was clear that these were to be resisted. There were attempts by the government to make us see Africans as rural, tribalized, unsophisticated, and not part of the modern world. Whereas even at that age, I encountered Africans in suits, with smart hats, on the streets of the city reading newspapers, or in small rooms at the back of our house, dressed up for church on Sundays or in starched aprons, but never in skins, never in beads, never in a grass hut, never smoking a pipe. They spoke English. Some of them were lawyers like my parents. They did not live in dark, smoky huts lit by a single candle, but were there with us in the brilliant lights of the city. The idea of otherness had to be repudiated, not just because it came up against experience. For even in Johannesburg, to tell the truth, you could see people recently arrived from rural areas with blankets and straw hats. Outside Pretoria, there were Ndebele huts, just as in the films. They are still there, they still just look like the films. But because to accept these images was to accept the otherness, the separation, the whole panoply of laws and worlds made by the nationalist government as natural. And because it flew in the face of what it would be for everyone to be equal, not to be second-class citizens, not to be defined by their blankets, the straw hut. Although I did not express it in those terms, identity politics was incompatible at the end with the universalist political ideal. And South African artists who used ethnographic or tribal or traditional African forms of the mask or wooden carvings always looked as ideological standard bearers for the National Party and its policies. And it took me a long time to unlearn this. Until 20 years ago, in the Natural History Museum in Cape Town, amongst the dioramas showing extinct quaggas and rhinoceroses and lions, there was a diorama of a Bushman family, a mother, father, children around a fire, preparing the evening meal. Now, there was a frisson as to whether these were stuffed specimens, like the lions or the rhinoceri, or whether they were casts. And they were, in fact, body casts, but there were stuffed specimens as well, though not on that display. A South African woman, Sarki Bartman, exhibited as the Hottentot Venus, was taken to Europe and put on living display in London and Paris. Her genitals were studied in a not unfamiliar combination of science and prurience. And after she died, she was dissected and parts of her body stayed pickled on display. Now, this is a 19th century project, a completion of an 18th century encyclopedist idea of cataloguing knowledge. It continued into the 20th century, and only in the last 3 years have there been a restitution of her remains. In the new dispensation in South Africa, it seemed inappropriate for the diorama of the Bushman family cooking round their fire to be seen as part of natural history. And there were plans to move the display to the Museum of Cultural History, where they could be seen in a comparative display of other ways of cooking and living. But then there was a spokesman on behalf of the descendants of those who had been cast in plaster, who claimed they would in fact rather be kept with the animals, that the animals were closer to their beliefs and their concept of themselves than the vitrines of blue and white Dutch tiles and the hierarchies of Dutch lace in the Cultural History Museum. And at the moment they remain in the Natural History Museum, but in the storeroom, waiting for another reclassification, a limbo. Now, this limbo, this space of indeterminacy, is vital. A space where you know understanding is limited, contested, and inadequate, where a failure of understanding becomes the only correct understanding. The terrains that museums of Africa cover all over the world are still contested and unclear spaces. And not just in Africa. In Paris, you have ambulances traveling from the Louvre to the Quai Branly, taking specimens from one to the other. In the Louvre, there is still a small section devoted to African art and to admitting objects made inside Africa to the pantheon of artists and their leavings in the Louvre. And there are journeys from the Louvre to the Quai Branly, where another restitution is made, where objects are not seen now as abstractions and abstract embodiments of beauty, but are given full respect, with detailed labels, explanatory labels. The best works of the most knowledgeable curators surround the objects that were brought back from the colonies. In which space are they given their right honor? In both and in between the two, I would suggest. When they are stable and ensconced in either space, they are wrong. It is only in the instability of the move, in the limbo of transportation and uncertainty, that they are right, in the gap between the two certainties. Where are we now? We are still stuck in the studio, with this weight of questions of Europe and Africa pressing down on us. Still with the image of Africa and the outside look, the split between making and looking, with the colonial membrane between the two. Let's look at this membrane, this looking between the inside and the outside. A meeting point of internal and external looking and projection. Now, here is a lino cut by John Mafangejo, one of the great artists of Namibia and one of the great masters of this medium. There are clear stylistic elements we recognize from German expressionist prints. Now, some of the most remarkable images to come out of South Africa have been the form of lino cuts. The image in lino, as opposed to a woodcut or wood engraving, they're broad and simple. There's an affinity with the decorative fabrics in various African countries, white fabric with black ribbon sewn onto it. Images are not constructed with the illusionistic fine web of lines we have in an etching or an engraving, where the line becomes flesh, cloth, cloud, or tree, but from large blocks of black and white. Thick lines, broad decisions. There's an immediate resonance with carving. The lino block is a shallow relief carving, and that the line of it is halfway between the looseness of a drawn line and the resistance and the hard line of a material to be cut. But the relationship to traditional Africa is not that simple. The route from the prints back to the wood carving. Mafangejo and many other artists like him were trained at a rural art center, in his case, the Lutheran Arts and Crafts Center in Rorke's Drift. Now, this art center was run by Swedish missionaries who came, like Plato's philosopher, to lead people into the light in the best possible way by trying to take them out of poverty. The printmaking was one element. Weaving and pottery were other things taught, in the hope that art students would learn skills that would produce an income. The aesthetic education, the books brought, the images shown, were part of a larger emancipatory interest. The images the missionaries brought and the art teachers brought were images of other lino cuts and other wood cuts, very largely by German expressionist artists. And these painters, in turn, had found many of their images and sources in the ethnographic masks, carvings, and textiles that had been brought back to the metropolitan center in Europe from adventurers, bureaucrats, and traders. So Mafangejo does go back to an African tradition, but through the double lens of the missionaries and German artists. And in later lectures, we will return to this extraordinary richness of mixed and adulterated traditions. In the hands of Mafangejo and many other artists like him, lino cut regained a powerful narrative presence similar to chapbooks in European art history. It is perhaps too strong to say the lino cut is the art form of anti-colonialism, but it is an important part of it. Perhaps here we can do a quick side journey to consider the association with different printmaking techniques and the historical niche. One thinks of the rigidity of the Protestant north of Europe and the hardness of steel engraving, the obsessive, precise Protestant work ethic, and the looseness and speed of etching in the Latin South. We can think of the smoothness of silkscreen, the unambiguousness of silkscreen, and Warhol can stand in here for the clear division, for the jingoistic certainty of the Cold War. And now we have the computer-generated print, the photoshopped image for our era of war with clean hands, of the drone flown from Fort Lauderdale, which drops its bombs 14,000 miles away, of the hands with neither blood nor ink on them, an art and a war made at a distance. Now, there is a theory in self-defense manuals that the key thing when attacked is to stay on your feet. The closeness of your face to your assailant can help. There's an ethical demand in the presence of the face of the other. And this diminishes with distance. So if you fall to the ground, your face is further, your head becomes a legitimate target for boots. How much easier a target 30,000 feet below, 14,000 miles away, with every face invisible. Now, I remarked in the previous lecture on the need for stupidity in the studio. Here I would add a claim for the need to get one's hands dirty. Through this morass of history, expectations denied, overlays of different brutality, of internal brutality, strides Picasso. Looking neither to the left nor the right, taking a carving here, a mask there, a dogon door at this village, a neck rest from under that man's head, ready to reconstruct how we make the human body, how we can look at the world, to open ways of seeing and making unanticipated either in Europe or in Africa. And how I envy his innocence, his ability and need not to look behind the mask, to have no need to see the face of the other, to have the mask alone in the studio with his canvas and his paints, an innocent made possible by distance from the colonies, by temperament, by social milieu, which is no longer possible. Certainly not in Johannesburg, where every approach to the mask, to the carving, is through a minefield. And the only safe route is through Europe, through Picasso. But let it be said, this envy for Picasso is not really for his innocence, but for the miraculous, astonishing, overflowing inventiveness of his studio, for the abundance of energy meeting the world as it comes into the studio, for a model demonstration of what it is to be at work in the studio. The optimism of Mozart and Picasso seemed no longer possible. To see only the outline of the mask, of the continent, now needs a willful blindness. There are many images I would like to show, but I feel they are all reduced by the context. They become illustrations of an idea rather than the result of less clear, inchoate provocations, all connected to the idea of Africa and Europe that I've been talking about. I would show them in a non-programmatic way. I feel I should show images that deny the text of the lecture, or at least are at right angles to them, to show the excess of impulses, the excess of making. A material gluttony to describe the drowning surfeit of histories, of ideas, of different understandings. There is a scene in Black Box, the miniature theatre with the automated figures, which shows the measuring of skulls. And this, of course, relates to the measuring of skulls in Berlin after the genocide in the 1920s and 30s. But this text emerges after the fact. And even the image emerges after the fact. First in the studio was the fact of a pair of dividers, with the possibility of their stiff-legged gait, an angular military precision. Now, anything hinged at the center suggests legs, an anthropomorphism that comes to us rather than something we impose upon it. Scissors, dividers, hinged rulers, the divided roots of a mandrake. We don't impose an anthropomorphism, we are unable to resist it. These are performances demanded by an object. In a shop of 19th century cooking implements in Paris, Cuisinophile, I saw a collection of spiral egg whisks, which even on the shelves of the shop presented themselves as a possible chorus of women in hooped skirts. With an addition of a paper head and a cloth, an egg whisk becomes a Herrera woman. A slow bend in the spring becomes a slow bend in the body. Now, I had hoped at one stage, making the black box, to explode and reconstitute a jug and later a coffee pot. But this became too complicated an engineering process. How to get the pieces to fit together again when they had exploded. So I tried using a radio-controlled mocha pot, controlling it with a joystick of a radio-controlled machine. I was forced to simplify the explosion, and a flat skull suggested itself as a possible subject, using the unevenly pivoted levers of an erector set to make it. The exploding skull and the dividers were pressed into service to perform the scene from the 1904 genocide. They were like commedia dell'arte performers waiting for the script of the day. There is a coming together of that which is inside the studio, the dividers, the erector set, the pot, the egg whisk, the paper, the charcoal, the glue, and that which arrives from outside, Chilembue's letter, Schikaneder, Mozart's music, the vitrines and dioramas of the museum, the phone call to my daughter in Oxford to remind me of the chronology of the invention of Africa, calling history into the studio. The bastard clash of that which comes in and that which would go out, the pressure of the material to become something else, the reams of white paper in the drawer and the ink and the charcoal waiting for this collision. The studio becomes thick with geography and time, upwards and backwards from the Hereros in German Southwest Africa to Chilembwe in Nyasaland, slaves being taken from further north on the coast of Africa, Arab traders arriving from the east, Hegel amongst the pyramids in 1808, and above them all, at the top of the map, Plato sitting at the edge of the cave, now looking down into its darkness, now looking up, checking the position of the sun. It is in this impure mixture of history, ideas, and materials that a sense tries to emerge, as a drawing, as a film, here as a lecture. And I feel very strongly the lack of clarity, the jumping from subject to subject in this talk, and grateful for your patience in making these jumps and leaps. And the shift between wanting to make it smoother, to make more elegant connections, to find arcs of history that have a smoother trajectory, between wanting this elegant clarity of a whole blackboard full of equations reduced to a single line, and wanting to insist on the gaps, on the non sequiturs. As it is in these gaps and incompletions that we make the space where the work can emerge. Neither chaos nor clarity, but where the saying badly becomes the precondition for finding new words. Thank you.